CPU and GPU pricing and availability is still a bit of a mess, but is the situation improving? Can we expect to get back to PC building anytime soon? Well, let's take a look at what is happening in the market this month. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. As we continue on in this crisis of component availability, I thought it would be a good idea to check back in every once in a while to see what the current situation is with the CPU and GPU markets, and in particular, to see whether we are headed in a better or worse direction. We did a similar sort of thing several years ago during the last crypto boom. Obviously, we were a much smaller channel back then, so hello to all our new viewers, but it's time to bring back these update sorts of videos. First up, let's talk about the GPU market, because the main question on everyone's mind is, when will this madness end? When are GPUs actually going to be in stock, and what are things looking like today? Well, first up, unless you have been living under a rock, it will come as no surprise that you cannot buy a current or last generation GPU from any brand at the MSRP right now, or at least in most situations. On Newegg, the fastest GPU you can actually purchase right now at something near an MSRP is the NVIDIA GeForce GT 1030, although really this is supposed to be an $80 US product and it's being sold for well over $120 US for the most part. If you want a newer product from either the NVIDIA RTX 30 series or AMD's Radeon RX 6000 series, you'll have to have your finger on the pulse for when these cards come in stock. But that situation really only applies right now in some markets, in particular the US, where retailers like Newegg tend to sell cards directly from OEMs at or near the MSRP when they have stock, bypassing local distributors. In other regions like Australia, we're stuck with a different situation. Current gen GPUs can be found in stock, but the pricing is ridiculous. As an example, over on PC Ksky, there is limited supply for all current GPUs except for the RTX 3080 and RTX 3060 Ti, but the reason these cards are in stock is because prices are grossly inflated. The cheapest RTX 3090 is from Inno3D and it's priced at 3,200 Australian dollars, which is roughly 1,000 AUD higher than the base $1,500 US MSRP converted into our local currency with tax applied. This is the same for other models. The cheapest RTX 3070 is about $600 Australian too expensive. The RTX 3060 should be $500 Aussie or so, but is currently on sale for $850. The RX 6800 XT and RX 6800 are about $750 and $600 overpriced respectively. And this isn't to single out PC Ksky because every other retailer in Australia is doing the exact same thing with GPU pricing right now, whether the cards are in stock or out of stock. I used Australia as an example here because it's closest home for us, but a quick glance at several other countries reveals similar behaviour. Cards like the RTX 3060 being sold in Europe for the equivalent of $600 US for a product with a $330 MSRP is an absolute joke. So if faced with one of two bad situations, either you can see products listed at the MSRP but you can't buy them, or you can buy products but are faced with insane price inflation. And depending on your region, you may not have any MSRP cards listed or available at all. And we've been in this situation for many months now. As for the reasons why, what we are hearing from various parties remains the same. Everyone is looking to blame someone else. Retailers are blaming distributors and OEMs depending on the regional distribution situation, claiming that any time they look to reorder new GPUs to sell, suddenly the prices have increased. We have a good relationship with some retailers here in Australia, and the messaging has been pretty consistent. They cannot sell graphics cards cheaper locally, or they would be losing money, and they are frustrated at being blamed for ridiculously high prices. OEMs are claiming that their margins for these new GPUs are similar to previous generations, suggesting that instead of OEMs inflating prices and passing that down to retailers, it's AMD and NVIDIA making these cards expensive to purchase. But then when we ask AMD and NVIDIA, we hear frustration similar to retailers, where they claim lower priced graphics cards should be possible and are annoyed they aren't getting a slice of the inflated pricing pie when prices do increase. We don't have any contacts at distributors, so we were unable to gauge their position on this, but I'd imagine that like retailers, partners, and GPU makers, they too would look to pass the blame onto someone else. The lack of any clarity on why prices at some retailers, so not even scalper pricing on eBay, is so high is a bit suspicious to me, given that we're now months into this market situation. No one has been willing to explicitly identify why a $330 GPU is selling in some regions for the equivalent of $600 as an example. While I don't know for sure, the assumption many would be making here is that a significant chunk of this price inflation is pure profit going into the hands of someone, although who exactly is taking that cut isn't known with any certainty. If I had to speculate, the most likely reason for high prices is that OEMs and especially distributors are looking to cash in on sky-high demand. On top of that, there are some genuine concerns around component availability, such as for GDDR memory, raw materials, and surface mount components, plus increasing logistics costs. These are all hurting the ability to manufacture cards for sale at the suggested retail price. However, it sounds like while these reasons can be legitimate, it's also being used as an excuse to raise profit margins under guise of high demand, low supply. We haven't heard any legitimate or believable reason why, say, some RTX 3070s are being sold in Australia at the equivalent of, say, $900 instead of a more reasonable inflation of around, say, $600, while resupplies in regions like the US often include pricing closer to the MSRP. Now, I'm sure there is a reason, it's just that people we speak to aren't willing to give that reason. And I really wish I had better information for you, being able to pinpoint the exact reasons, but I don't. It's still a bit of a mess. However, there are some points of clarity that we do have. One surrounds why the RTX 3060 Ti and RTX 3080 are significantly harder to find than other GPUs like the RTX 3070 and RTX 3090. This includes why the RX 6900 XT is a bit easier to find than the RX 6800 XT. And the reason appears to be down to where Nvidia and AMD are prioritizing their GPU supply. If we take the 3090 and 6900 XT as examples, these products are full or near full versions of the silicon. To make an RTX 3080 or RX 6800 XT, the silicon needs to be cut down in some way, reducing the SM or CU counts to the level required for that product. Normally this is done through binning. A defective GA102 die may still be usable as an RTX 3080, but not as an RTX 3090, so it's reserved for the lower tier card. If defect rates on a certain product are good, then over time you might end up with a situation where it's possible to make many more RTX 3090s than RTX 3080s, because most GA102 dies could be binned for the 3090. Similar situation with the 6900 XT and bins for the 6800 XT, there just may not have been very many defective dies. However, when demand is fairly consistent and stock is sitting on shelves, it wouldn't make sense to produce a ton of RTX 3090s if they aren't selling, while RTX 3080s are scarce. So a company like Nvidia will often start cutting down good dies to make lower tier products, which then maximizes sales. This is a very common practice. But when the higher tier product is flying off shelves and you have enough good dies to make them, it's in a company's best interests to prioritize the higher tier part and clean up on large margins. That's what we are seeing in the market today. The only RTX 3080s, 6800 XTs and RTX 3060 Ti's being made right now are from genuine defective dies, while the full silicon versions like the 3090, 3070, 3060 and 6900 XT are being prioritized. Nvidia are not turning GPUs that could be 3090s into RTX 3080s. They are going all into those 3090s. And so this is a basic explainer why we can expect to see awful stock for the RTX 3080 and RTX 3060 Ti to continue for some time, at least until demand for the higher tier equivalents dies down. While this is bad for those products, it's a bit better news for parts like the RTX 3060 and RX 6700 XT. Both of these use new dies and aren't relying on defective versions of larger dies to be produced. It's too early to say how supply will play out on those parts, especially for the 6700 XT, which isn't even released, but our expectation is these parts should be relatively easier to obtain than, say, an RTX 3060 Ti for the time being. The other promising thing that will affect GPU supply moving forward is cryptocurrency pricing. GPUs are obviously being used in droves for mining, so if the price continues to increase on popular coins, there will be a never-ending demand for GPUs to be used in mining. However, that's not really happening right now, at least with the price of, say, Ethereum. Of course, pricing is highly volatile due to the nature of cryptocurrency, but since a peak in late February, pricing has failed to reach that level again. Mining on new GPUs remains highly profitable, so it's not like pricing plateauing is going to instantly solve this problem, but a 1-month trend that's reasonably flat is better than that price continuing to trend up. And currently, GPU prices are correlated to crypto prices on the scalper market. Back in mid-February, when we talked about GPU pricing in a Q&A segment, we noticed that eBay completed listing prices for GPUs spiked dramatically around the same time as Ethereum prices spiked in late January and were continuing to rise. This suggested that at that point, we hadn't even reached the peak of what GPU prices would be for new products. Fast forward a couple of weeks and Steve talked about current eBay prices in his RTX 3060 review, highlighting how ridiculously inflated some of these GPU prices are today. However, there's good news because the pricing seen in that video hasn't changed dramatically from what we saw in mid-February as crypto prices began evening out. Tom's Hardware have a great article series going on at the moment where they track used GPU pricing on eBay on a daily basis. Data from the last 2 weeks shows GPU prices flattening out and hitting a small downward trend, although again the situation is volatile and they hadn't updated the article at the time of filming for the current week. In any case, we are seeing what appears to be the peak in GPU pricing occurring right now on the scalper market. There are no guarantees what happens from here. If we see another huge spike in crypto pricing, we can expect to see that reflected in the GPU market. However, if things hold steady for a while, as has happened in the past after a strong boom in a certain coin, GPU pricing stabilizes and recovers as demand falls away. The steady stream of new GPU supply and the introduction of new mid-range products from both Nvidia and AMD will also be assisting here, although the process could still take a couple of months. So while the overall situation is obviously not great for buying a graphics card right now, there is a small amount of light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. This is something we'll continue to monitor over the next few months, as hopefully we continue to see that sort of downward trend in pricing. Okay, so we've talked at length about the GPU market, now it's time to change tunes and look at the CPU market. Unlike with graphics cards, there is quite a lot of good news to share about CPU availability, as there is clear evidence this market is improving and slowly returning to something that resembles normal. So let's talk about that. Firstly, there are currently no availability issues with Intel's 10th generation processors in the lead up to the 11th gen launch later this month. This has actually been true for a few months now, stretching back into 2020. You've been able to head to virtually any retailer and buy a 10th gen processor straight up without having to wait for restocks, and often these chips are priced below their listed tray price, so there's never been a better time to buy an Intel CPU. Some examples of this include very popular products right now like the Intel Core i5-10400F, which is listed on Newegg for just $150 as a boxed retail model, which is lower than Intel's $157 tray price for bulk units. The Core i7-10700KF is just $310, well down from its $360 recommended customer price, as is the Core i9-10900K at $470. In fact, this Core i9 part was very difficult to find, especially in its non-F variant, for months after its launch, but now it's readily available at a discount. Now, these Intel processors may not be overly attractive to someone that needs a strong level of productivity performance, at least compared to AMD's Ryzen parts, but they still present strong gaming performance. And that doesn't look to be changing significantly with Intel's 11th gen line based on some of the first 11700K reviews we've seen, so I think right now Intel's lineup is looking not too bad depending on the use case you have. Most of the Intel processors I searched for were available from a major retailer like Newegg, although not all are available at a discount, one example there being the Core i3-10100, but overall Intel's stock situation is looking healthy, and given upcoming Rocket Lake chips are also built on 14nm, there is no reason to believe that supply will be severely constrained on Intel's side. But I'm sure what many people are wondering is, what is the situation with AMD's Ryzen processors? And there's some good news to share here as well, at least for some products. As of producing this video, both the Ryzen 7 5800X and Ryzen 5 5600X are in stock on Newegg at their respective MSRPs, $450 and $300 US. And this is a fairly new development in those two processors, which were out of stock and not available as early as just a couple of weeks ago. From looking at several other retailers around the world, this looks to be an increasingly common situation, depending on the retailer, of course. Here in Australia, you can buy the 5800X easily and the 5600X at some retailers. At Mind Factory over in Germany, they are expecting stock within days. Overclockers.co.uk has stock right now. I could go on, but you get the idea at this point. Stock for the 5800X and 5600X is recovering nicely. It's taken around 4 months but we are getting there. And this is good timing for AMD. As mentioned previously, Intel is set to launch new 11th gen processors on March 30th, and we know these parts top out at 8 cores. Having AMD's 6 and 8 core processors readily in stock provides competition to Intel's new Rocket Lake parts, and hopefully won't make it a situation where, regardless of how Intel's parts performs, they basically win the market by default due to a lack of their competitors' stock. Strong competition always benefits the consumer, and having components in stock is the first step to what will hopefully be a price battle for high-performance processors. What remains incredibly difficult to find are AMD's Ryzen 9 processors, the Ryzen 9 5900X and Ryzen 9 5950X. These are out of stock basically everywhere, with supply only filtering in slowly. Local retailer PC Case Gear has flagged that the supply versus demand situation for the 5950X is a little better than the 5900X right now. They are expecting all remaining orders to be filled by the end of the month for the 5950X. The 5900X isn't so lucky, with PC Case Gear still working through a backlog of orders from December. Some retailers like Mindfactory aren't even listing the Ryzen 9 parts right now, while others don't allow pre-orders, so you'll have to keep a lookout if you want a part at the MSRP. So why are AMD's Ryzen 5 and 7 processors available but the higher end parts not? Surely AMD would want to sell more of their expensive CPUs and less of their lower tier products, right? Well, it is a bit more complicated than that, especially when we factor in the supply constraints at TSMC's 7nm fabs. One factor that's playing into this is that AMD are about to launch new EPYC CPUs shortly, which use the exact same 7nm chiplets as their Ryzen 5000 desktop line, or at least that's what we're expecting. As we know from the binning process, some of these chiplets are better than others, and on the desktop line generally, these better chiplets go into higher end, higher clocked parts like the 5950X, leaving the lesser quality silicon for say a 5800X if all CPU cores are intact. But the better bin chiplets are not only in demand with the 5950X, but also with EPYC CPUs, which require the best silicon for efficiency and frequency reasons depending on the part. While AMD can focus most of the lower bins towards 5800X parts, supply of better bins, which tend to be only a small portion of the overall amount of chiplets produced, need to be split between 5950X and EPYC. Generally speaking, server parts are higher margin, so AMD is going to focus their efforts there. The 5900X ends up in the worst position of all for a multitude of reasons. This part requires 2 6-core chiplets. If yields are good, then the amount of 6-core chiplets being made is going to be limited. And if AMD is selling through their entire stock of 8-core chiplet parts, 5800X, 5950X, then there would be no reason to cut down working 8-core chiplets to make 6-core chiplet CPUs. On top of that, the 5900X requires a better bin of these 6-core chiplets than the 5600X to hit higher frequencies of 4.8 GHz boost versus 4.6 GHz. Then additionally, demand for the 5900X is higher than that of something like a 5950X for a very supply constrained processor, and we end up with a low stock environment that may continue for some time, at least until parts like the 5950X and EPYC aren't flying off the shelves as fast as they can make them. With limited supply of 6-core chiplets, AMD are also juggling a situation where they may have the option between selling one 5900X or two 5600X processors. There could be several reasons why AMD may prefer to sell 5600Xs for now, such as upcoming competition from Intel, and the fact that the 5900X is less than twice as expensive as the 5600X, although that's a large oversimplification of the product costs associated with these parts. My overall point here is that I wouldn't be expecting the 5900X to be overflowing with stock anytime soon. If anything, this will be the last processor to be widely available, and that could still take a couple of months. While Ryzen 5000 supply is improving for the 5600X and 5800X, supply is not good enough yet to cause flow-on effects for older products. Parts like the Ryzen 5 2600 and Ryzen 5 3600 are in stock, so that's a good thing, but pricing is at MSRP level for CPUs that are approaching 2 years old or more. The 3600, for example, was sold for a period in the middle of 2020 for as low as $170, but it's now back up to its $200 MSRP. The Ryzen 5 2600, would you believe it, has a historic low in the region of $120, but for the last couple of months has been more like $190. That's how much the 7nm supply situation has been affecting older processors, even though that Ryzen 5 part isn't built on a 7nm node. In many situations, when faced with a choice between a 2-year-old Ryzen CPU at its launch price or an Intel 10th gen processor, you may be better off with the Intel part. something like the Intel Core i5-10400F at $150 seems like a much better deal than a Ryzen 5 2600 at $190 as an example. Anyway, that's it for our look at the current state of the GPU and CPU markets for sort of the middle-ish of March as it stands. We will be updating you guys as time goes on with these sorts of updates, taking a look at what's happening in the GPU market, in the CPU market, when are we going to get these products in stock and available. And I think the next time that we do this sort of video, we should have a better idea of supply for things like RTX 3060, RX 6700 XT, and also potentially Intel's new 11th gen processors as well. So yeah, this is kind of where we're at the moment. We did this previously for the past mining boom and supply issues, so hopefully you guys find this useful and saves you a bit of time researching sort of what's going on in the market at the moment. So yeah, that's it for this one. If you're interested in supporting the channel, Patreon or Floatplane, links to those are in the description below. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.